Testing, testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Is that working? Hello, hello, hello. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, hello. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Hello. Hey. Hello, hello, hello. Okay. Marilyn, can you hear me? Okay, before we begin, can I ask some questions? Hey, woman, I want you to behave. Seriously. Do you want... She's out of control. Only because, I like to embarrass people. You know what she did to me? She was putting on lipstick, and then she goes like this. Pat, would you control your wife? I actually thought I'd be farther along in this history, but I'm kind of going accidentally slower. But I decided this morning, do I just skip ahead or do I'm going to go really slow, rather than cover a couple centuries at once. Do you guys mind? And give me feedback. If this class is too slow, just let me know, because we're still in the early church. But that's what I kind of think, as long as we get the early church down right, then later controversies in the church, you can say, but that's how the early church did it. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't. Hard working with you people. Why don't we get in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. So I was going to jump ahead, but now I'm not. Last week I didn't get very far, but I ended with women in the early church, so I just want to pick that up again. So we have this early church document called the Shepherd of Hermes. And interestingly enough, he speaks about women's role in the very early church. And in Judaism, there is women who weaved in the temple. And so this other early church document, the Proto-Evangelium of St. James, says that Mary was one of the virgin temples that did weaving. And remember when they throwed the dice for the unseamless garment of Christ? That's actually what a priest would wear. And the legend is Mary is the one who wove that for Christ. But in Judaism, women had liturgical functions, albeit different than men. They did have liturgical functions. And in Judaism, in the early church, women had liturgical roles. So it's upsetting to some people, but even the Bible says there were women deacons. And women standing with the deacons, the priests, but also there's a testamentum domini, where widows who dedicate themselves, those who pray without ceasing, quote unquote, I love that, had a liturgical role. And I say, why are you mentioning that? Because I've always wanted to do this. In the early church, and it's still in the rites today, it's in the sacramentary, that like Catherine wanted to dedicate herself as the order of a widow, not just the fact that she lost her husband, but then widows would take vows to pray for the church constantly, and they were supposed to be a source of wisdom and also service to the local church. So I do love that image. I was actually with our grieving group. I was going to mention that to them because I'd like to start that again. What if women who had no intention of ever getting married, widows, say, I'm going to dedicate my remaining life to praying at the local church and being there. Oddly enough, that's what the early church did. Now, note, no early church document mentions that there are women priests. That wasn't in the history of Judaism. The early church, there wasn't. But there was deacons and all these other things for women. So going back, was the early church Catholic? And I want to cover that because Dan mentioned that last time. What I want to fold into in a little while is Constantine, who will come emperor in the 300s. And it's a common trope of Lutherans and Baptists that the early church was not Catholic. That you had Catholics and then you had Christians, as if they're two separate things. And there's a famous book that started in the Baptist book that said, this is kind of funny, that in the Dark Ages, the Catholics killed all the Baptists. Well, historically, Baptists are really a 19th century religion. No, but so they'd say, well, you're like the Cathars, that the Cathars were actually Baptists. Well, that's not true at all. The Cathars were these heretical group that believe that there's two gods. We believe that there's one. That there's two gods and everything material is evil. So they took vows of poverty. They took vows of chastity. They didn't eat. They're basically vegan. They would eat no meat and no eggs because all wealth and meat and stuff is evil. I don't think modern Baptists are vegans. They promote the gospel of prosperity. I really don't think they believe in poverty. They're not Cathars. And what the Baptists and Lutherans are trying to do is solve this problem that Jesus said that the gates of hell would not prevail against the church. So some of these Protestants, since they're 19th century inventions, they create a new narrative. So in this 1930s book, this Baptist, the book is called The Trail of Blood. And the conclusion is that the Catholic Church is really an offshoot of ancient Baptist religion. So you see how they changed history? And then they said that in the Dark Ages, that the Catholic Church killed 50 million Baptists. 50 million? Think about that for a minute. There weren't 50 million people in Europe during the Dark Ages. In the 500s, there was only about 27 million. Then the Black Plague takes place, and Europe's population drops down to half that, maybe 18 million. And then if 50 million people were slaughtered, where's their graves? Do you know what I mean? So they rewrite history. So they'd say the early church was actually Baptist and Catholics came in with Constantine. So the problem is they have to do that because if you said, well, Christ said that the church would always remain, then if the Baptists came in as a 19th century religion, you'd have to say, well, what kind of God is Christ if for almost 2,000 years he let the church disappear? Does that make sense? So there's this idea that, well, there was Christians and then there were Catholics, but Christians had to go underground because Catholics would kill them. But the prophecy about the church is we're the mustard seed. A mustard seed would start off very tiny and hated, but then grow into this huge, large tree. That prophecy wouldn't be true. The Baptist church is really very, very tiny and never became a huge tree. So it's really more propaganda. And remember, the word Catholic means universal. And then you'd have to say, well, what does that mean? Now, Jimmy Swaggart really promoted this, that the Catholic Church started with Constantine in the 4th century. Where did he get that? He actually got that from the Muslims. So Mormons, Muslims, Baptists, Lutherans, and Jimmy Swaggart believe that the Catholic Church started with Constantine. Now, because I drive around, my joke is Coeur d'Alene has a church on every corner. That when I first got here, I was kind of shocked how many churches there were. It's my joke about Butte, Montana. Have you guys ever been to Butte, Montana? Every corner has a bar on it. I don't know what that means. How dare you say that about the Irish? Coeur d'Alene, every corner has a bar on it, or a church on it. So, I just would Google these churches because some of them I've never heard of. And I'm not bad-mouthing them. The altar, they're very nice people. They help the poor. They're just down the road. So I go on their website, and the pastor says, well, the Catholic Church was started by Constantine. And before that, there was just Christians. That's historically inaccurate. That's crazy talk. And even last week, somebody asked me, they said, well, I was told that Christian and Catholic are not the same thing. And they cite Acts. So I'm going to read it to you. It says, so Barnabas went to Tarsus looking for Saul. And when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. For the whole year they met with the church and taught a large company of people. And in Antioch, the disciples were first called Christians. So that's proof. They were Christians and they were Catholics. But the problem with that is that actually that's what the enemies of the church called Christians. Christian would be, a follower of Christ. Well, hold on, I'll explain it. So, yes, in Antioch, they were known as Christians, but in Jerusalem, what were they called in Jerusalem? The people of the way. Yes, somebody got that. Who got that? Oh, okay, you can have another donut. And the point being is, in these different cities, what do we call ourselves? They came up with different names. It'd be like this. Is St. Thomas a different religion than St. Pius? No, we call ourselves different names, but we're the same religion. Since the local church had its own title, but still considered themselves one church. So the entire church was called the Catholic Church. And one of the things Peter did before he left Rome, was to found the church in Antioch. Antioch was the third largest city in Rome. It's in Syria. It's the first city ever to have lit boulevards. And Antioch is really important in the early church. Peter started it, and then he ordains this guy named Evagrius. I'm mispronouncing it. Evodius, to appoint him as bishop. And Evodius believed that he was believed to be one of the 70 disciples that Christ sent out. And then Evodius, he reigns as bishop for a short time because guess what happens? He gets martyred. That's what happens to everybody. And but that wasn't the end of the story. He had ordained this guy Ignatius, and then actually Peter ordains Ignatius, but then Ignatius becomes pope after Evodius. And Ignatius actually taught with St. Paul in Antioch. So St. Paul and Ignatius knew each other. And so Nero, when he blames the Christians for the fire in Rome, they were convicted as Christians are convicted as haters of humanity. And Rome wanted to execute Christians. Now, the rule was you would execute Christians in the place that they were as a warning to everybody else. But when it came to Ignatius, because he was a high-profile bishop, ordained by Peter, Nero wanted to make an example of him. So he wanted to be, to be especially gruesome. So rather than have him executed in Antioch, he takes Ignatius on this kind of tour of the Roman Empire. He brings him to Rome on this tour, and along the way, just to frighten any Christians. But Ignatius, he flips the script, and in each place, he would write letters to the Christians. And he'd say, don't try and save me, because they were saying, we can try and kidnap you. No, this is what I was meant to do. And instead of frightening the Christians, his martyrdom empowered him. And he wrote all these letters. And in the letters, he emphasized the unity among Christians. And so he's a very famous person you'd have to know. In one of the letters, he writes, where Christ Jesus is the Catholic Church. Now, think about it. This was written in 107. Just imagine that the Bible was finally finished in the year 100. In 107, Ignatius uses this term, Catholic, and when he's writing in a letter, everybody knew what this term was. It wasn't like people were saying, what's that word? So the word seems to predate his use. And so it's quite early. The term Catholic was really quite early. And so this is the first use of it. And when he uses it, everybody knows what it means. And he exhorts Christians to follow their bishop, just in this, as you're supposed to follow Christ. And in the letter, he uses the term Christian and Catholic Church distinctively. If you're a disciple of Christ, you're a Christian. But each Christian assembly gathered together is the Catholic Church. Does that make sense? Thus, the Christians of Antioch are part of the Catholic Church. They were indeed Christian disciples that were also called Catholic. Does that make sense? So that's what that means. So when they said, well, no, there's Christians and there are Catholics, not even the early church documents would support that. And given the unbroken succession in Antioch from Peter to Evadius to Ignatius, any Christian today who wishes to identify himself as a biblical Christian and uses that Acts 11, it follows quite logically that he must also identify that the Christian Universal Assembly is called the Catholic Church. That's why Ignatius is titled the early church father Christian fundamentalists hate the most. Do you know why they hate him? Because think about this, it's 107. And in it, he speaks about the Eucharist and Eucharistic practices. He uses the term Catholic. He mentions the threefold order of bishops, deacons, and priests. He said, if you don't have bishop, priest, and deacon, then you don't have the Catholic Church. Now remember, many Protestants like to rewrite history, and they think that the New Testament is the blueprint for the church. Historically, it's the opposite. The church first gathered, then the church wrote the scriptures. And that's how early it is. There's only one bishop between Peter and Ignatius. But Protestants like to say, oh no, the Catholic Church started in the 300s. There's all these ancient church documents, one of them is Ignatius, that proves no. Like Ignatius mentions the four Gospels as well. The point being is that we're dealing with people who got Christianity from the apostles, who talked about the four Gospels, the sacraments, deacons, priests, the Catholic Church. And Ignatius notes that anyone who denies the humanity of Christ also denies the real presence of the Eucharist. Because a lot of people would say, well, Christ was a great leader, but he's not God incarnate. And Ignatius says, look at those people. Those are the same people who ignore the real presence. So you have Clement and Ignatius, both who spoke about the unity of the Catholic Church. He also says, where the bishop is, there's the church. And my point being is that we have all these ancient documents that are as old as the Bible. And the point is, the early church was not some unorganized band of Christian followers. They were a very organized group that practiced their faith. It was underground because of the persecution. But But no splinter group of Christians in the early church ever existed. Ignatius points out that if you're not in union with the church, you're not Christian. So there's all this biblical evidence that the early church was Catholic. Look at Acts. You had priests and deacons. Now, why did they call them priests? Because, try and make this, am I boring you too much? Well, if you're a Baptist minister, you're called a preacher. If you're Catholic, you're called a priest. What's the difference between a preacher and a priest? Well, yes, priests are apostolic, but what's the main difference in the term priest versus preacher? Yes, sacrifice. Priests in the Old Testament didn't preach that much. That's what rabbis did. A rabbi was a preacher. A priest offered sacrifice. Does that make sense? And think about how the early church worked. Priests would gather together, they would preach, but then they would celebrate the Eucharist. The Eucharist is a sacrifice. So if early Christians, if I was an early Christian, if I was a Protestant, all I would have done is preach. But they didn't call early Christian ministers rabbis. They called them priests because in the Eucharist we offer a sacrifice. Does that make sense? In a synagogue, all you got was preaching. But in the temple, you got a sacrifice. And so when they say, well, no, the Catholic Church started with Constantine, we have all these church documents that speaks about that hundreds of years before Constantine, speaking about Eucharist, Catholic Church, deacon, priest. And we have other documents. And this sounds kind of strange. You know what one of the really big fights was in the early church? What time to celebrate Easter? Now that sounds really minor from our standpoint, right? But we have about 100 documents arguing about what is the right time to have Easter. Do you know how many documents there are arguing about should we have priests or deacons? And guess how many documents there are arguing that? 0. So, if there was this big change to now we're going to organize by, in the 300s, by bishops and priests and deacons, there you would have evidence of arguments. But no, you have lots of arguments in the early church, but it's things like what time to celebrate Easter. You would have got at least one document on that. Does that make any sense? So anyhow, I'm probably... Yes? Right. Rabbis were in synagogues. Priests were in the temple. Rabbis don't offer sacrifice. Well, there could have been priests other places, that's true. But there's only one place you're allowed to offer a sacrifice in Judaism. What is the one place? The temple. No others, you're not allowed to offer a sacrifice any other place. So when the temple was destroyed, Judaism hasn't offered a sacrifice in 2,000 years. But the prophet Malachi said that there'd be a new temple. And the temple would be completely new, and Gentiles would become priests. And in this new temple, all around the world, sacrifice would be offered. The only one that fits that is the Catholic Church. Does that make sense? Okay. And here, this just drives me off the wall. But, and I know I mentioned this, but when I say the New Testament, what is the New Testament? What does the New Testament call the New Testament? What does Jesus say the New Testament is? Okay, sorry, I didn't get... I'll just tell you. It's the Eucharist. So the Old Testament is Moses' Passover, right? The New Testament that the prophets are talking about, the new is supposed to be when Christ comes, he would be a new Moses, and there'd be a new Passover, and a new temple, and a new promised land, and a new covenant. So the new covenant would be started by the Christ, and it would be started on Passover. So when Jesus says, takes the bread, the wine, and says, this is the new covenant, the New Testament, is not a book. It's the Eucharist. Does that make sense? So, like, if I said I preach the New Testament, I don't mean a book. I mean the Eucharist. Does that make sense? So, priests in the new early church wouldn't have just been preachers. They also would have been priests. So what did the early church look like? Well, let's go to Clement of Rome. Clement of Rome lived from 35 AD to 99 AD. So he would have died before the New Testament was fully put together. And Clement of Rome, he was the successor of Peter. It goes Peter, Linus, Clement. But they die really quick. But Clement writes this letter to the Corinthians because the Corinthians are just a pain in the rear end. And think about this. He was ordained by Peter. And the Corinthians are this pain in the rear end because they're kind of rebellious. And they wanted younger bishops. So in 88 AD, he writes them this letter exhorting them to get their act together. And he gives severe repercussions. You can't just ordain your own bishops. They have to be in line with the apostles. And the Corinthians got in line. Clement reinstated the clergy so that they have to be descended from the apostles. And you would think, going back to that Baptist or Lutheran idea, if there's just free-floating Christians, why would they obey the Pope, Clement? Does that make sense? They obeyed him because he was you can't just choose your own. Or this other document I mentioned, the Shepherd of Hermes, that's 2nd century. It's really great about this guy who's not real, he's Christian, but not very devout, and then he has this encounter with this lady. And anyhow, he brings up many moral issues. Like, have you ever seen the cartoon where one angel is on a shoulder and the devil is on the other? That actually comes from the early church, the Shepherd of Hermes. And anyhow, he comes up with that analogy. But once again, he speaks about bishops, priests, deacons, the Eucharist, the Catholic Church. So once again, a very early church document that seems to prove the early church was Catholic. Or another one, the martyrdom of St. Polycarp. Polycarp was a disciple of John the Apostle, and he gets caught, he gets martyred. And this is a small thing, the Romans, just to punish Christians when they martyr Polycarp, wanted to make sure that Christians couldn't collect their bones, because they used to collect the bones of the martyrs and use them as relics. So they had his bones thrown in the river, and guess what the Christians did? We went and got his bones. But that proves, think about this, like, Baptists don't have relics, but that's from the very early church. Does that make sense? Go ahead. Me too. I grew up Catholic. Partly, unfortunately, yeah. Yes, I'll explain that later. Well, I'll explain it right now. Why you didn't have deacons. Because in the 13th century, and that's a really good question, in the 13th century, they did away with deacons. So after St. Francis, they did have deacons. We've always had deacons. But you didn't have permanent deacons. So they switched in the 13th century in what they call the ladder of orders. So you'd first be an acolyte, then you would be a reader, and then you would be a deacon, and then you'd be a priest. No, brother, something else. So they did away with the permanent diaconate. Now that's not completely true, but that's just a rough sketch. Then in Vatican II, they said, no, the early church had garden full of different ministries. They'd have those who visited the sick. They had those who were deacons, which is an order, and priests and bishops. But then they had readers, and like the early church had a multitude. If you read St. Paul's letter, there's catechists and da-da-da-da-da. He lists off a bunch of ministries in the Catholic Church. In the Middle Ages, they'd say, well, we don't need all that. All you need is a priest. Which, does that mean, like, so all we need is priests. What's that?
Then you could just wear him out and get a new priest.
Well, that time they had more. But now, I really think, since the door is open, I'll give you my opinion, which I'm very shy about my opinion. But, okay, I'll tell you, even though, like, we're in a clergy deficit, right? But, over half the clergy in Idaho are from Africa. And so if I leave St. Pius, an African will be replaced. If Marouche, and I'm not putting down Africans, but the problem now is that the U.S. government has put clergy in the regular pile to get a visa. So when their visa runs out, they're going to have to go to the bottom of the list. And half of our clergy are Africans, but they won't be able to immediately come back to Idaho. So, like, I personally think, nobody's asked, but we're setting ourselves up for failure. Anyhow, so if I was a bishop, I would go back to the early church saying, oh no, we're going to have like in Samoa. They also don't have enough priests, but they rely heavily upon deacons and catechists. And it's a full-time job. And so, like, I think we should be making those choices rather than saying, well, we'll just import a bunch from Africa. Well, Africa has its own clergy shortage. It's not like there's plenty of priests in Africa. We just have money. But I don't know. I just kind of think I'd rather go the early church. But the reason why you weren't used to seeing deacons is that they were only deacons for a short time because they had this idea that the priest should do it all. But that wasn't the image of the early church. Well, right now, not so well. But, so going to another one who I absolutely love is Irenaeus. Irenaeus died in 189. Wow, he is brilliant, stunning in his theology, blows me out of the water. But one of the things, just to prove this idea that the early church was Catholic, he writes letter against heresies. And he points out that in the letter that anybody who teaches the gospel outside the Catholic Church is heresy. And the point being is that that's another example. Anybody who says, oh no, the Catholic Church was invented hundreds of years after the early church, look at all these sources. We would say, no, the Catholic Church was the early church. That's all there was. Or there's this guy named Clement of Alexandria, once again, in the early church. And he has these writings describing the early church as a hierarchy of bishops, priests, deacons. So anybody, like, there's all these documents. There's another guy, Hippolytus, very interesting. Saint Hippolytus was, in his letters, discussing how bishops to ordain priests and deacons, the laying on of hands. And this is hundreds and hundreds of years before Constantine. You have Cyprian of Carthage. Now, I like Cyprian of Carthage, St. Cyprian, but he was noted for always saying controversial things. That's why I like him. Do you guys, there's a crazy priest named Tim Ritchie. Have you ever met him? Like, Tim Ritchie has a mouth on him that, like, whenever there's a clergy meeting, I try and sit next to him because he says obnoxious things. He's not wrong, they're just obnoxious. St. Cyprian was kind of the same way. And so St. Cyprian from the early church, this is a great line I like about him, is, this sounds kind of strange. If you're a bishop, why does a bishop wear red? Because they were all martyrs. Does that mean you're accepting, I will die? If you're ordained a bishop, the Romans will want you dead. So that's why they wear red. And a bishop wears a wedding ring. The bishop gets a ring. At my ordination, I didn't get a ring. So, I don't like it when priests wear wedding rings. They can if they want. I just personally, I wasn't ordained. I didn't get a wedding ring. Who gets a wedding ring? The bishop. He's married to a diocese. And the problem is, even the early church, human beings haven't changed in 2,000 years. Somebody would be named bishop of one see, one diocese, but they would want a more larger metropolitan so that they would try and get that one after they were ordained for this diocese. And St. Cyprian says, this is what I mean when he throws out grenades. He said, a man who accepts the episcopacy in one diocese with his eye on a larger diocese to replace it is like the man who marries one woman with his eye on a younger woman to replace her with. That's a great 2,000-year-old document. But my only point being is that, you can say, oh, yeah, that's a very ancient Baptist document. That document only makes sense in the Catholic Church. Or another one, just St. Justin Martyr. His name was Justin, and he was martyred. But he was born in the year 100. So that's how early he is. He was born in the year 100, and he's Greek. And he becomes a Greek philosopher. He goes through different schools of Greek philosophy, but he is in love with Stoicism, which is a great Greek philosophy. He's in love with Stoicism. And I'm sure he's on the beach and he meets this guy who is a Christian. He says, oh, yes, I was Stoic as well until I met Christ. And Justin wants to argue with him. But the guy points out the faults of Greek philosophy and how Christianity is better than Greek. And he's totally in love and gets baptized. Then he goes to Rome and starts a school of philosophy to teach Christianity. Well, he argues with another philosopher how Christianity is better than Greek philosophy. The other guy loses, turns him into the Romans, and he's executed. But Justin Martyr has what he has to say. He has a lot to say talking about the Eucharist, the structure of the Mass. If you read Justin Martyr, you would know exactly what he's talking about because it's the same structure as the Mass today. So he was this fearless apologist for the faith, but he writes this beautiful description of the Mass. And everything, if you took a time machine and go back to the past through Justin Martyr, you'd realize it's all the same. So my point being is that there's all these early church documents. So why is the early church consistency important? Why is it important to look at this? Because it keeps us running after fads. We've been really, except for the Gloria in Mass, the Gloria was invented in the Middle Ages. We've had the same way of celebrating Mass for 2,000 years. And St. Irenaeus says, if you cut off a branch from a tree, if you keep cutting the branches off, what you're left with is a stick. This is the Catholic Church, and people want to cut things out of it. But this is the way it was from the very, very early church. And St. Jerome said if you can't trace your church back to the 12 apostles in Christ, then you're the bad influence that St. Paul warned about these preachers coming with a new gospel. So if you can't trace Lutheranism and Mormonism or baptism or Joseph Smith back to the 12 apostles, maybe it's a different gospel. Does that make any sense? So that's why. Go ahead, Catherine.
We spent a summer in Alaska, and they had a Catholic church there, and he was a married priest.
Yes, 20% of all priests are married.
I didn't know that he ever heard of that.
Get out, Catherine. Get out and see the world.
Well, I saw it there, and I went, huh.
Now,
How did they do that and be celibate priests?
okay, so the question is, when did celibacy start? So the early church, priests were not celibate. Some were, like St. Paul was a celibate. St. Paul writes, he says, hey, listen, the other apostles, not John and Paul were celibate. But he said the other apostles, when they travel with their wives. St. Paul was celibate. And this sounds kind of strange. The early church, priests were not celibate. That's not going to happen. I'm not even going to tell you when that's not going to happen for thousands of years. We'll get to that later. Now, if you were like a desert monk, if you were a monk, you did take a vow of celibacy, not priests. That won't happen for hundreds and hundreds of years. Some priests did, but that wasn't the norm. So we'll get into that later. But what I want to switch to is move to the persecutions. So remember, for the first 300 years, we're persecuted. And the reason why is in paganism, religion and politics were always twinned together, that they belonged together. So the Romans couldn't understand Christians not politically worshiping the emperor. Why would you worship Christ who died? Religion is supposed to support politics. So for early Romans, that was the path to success. So this gets into religion and politics. Originally, Christianity, being Christian, was not a political movement. That completely baffled the Romans. Since Christians were more loyal to Christ than the emperor, that's why these persecutions started. Now, always beware of emperor worship. That will affect Christianity after Constantine. But Christians refused to worship the state gods. Now, I mentioned this. Virgin martyrs. We have hundreds and hundreds of virgin martyrs. Why? They weren't killed because they were virgins. The Romans didn't care about that. They were killed because if you marry who your family tells you to marry. If you're a Christian, Christ raised up the dignity of marriage. Christ encouraged marriage to be a lifelong union. And so women thought they had the right to marry whoever they wanted. The Roman Empire wasn't going to tolerate that, and so they made an example of these virgins by, no, you marry who you want us to marry. Or there's this in 111, really quite early, there's this guy named Pliny. He was this Turkish governor, and he asked the emperor, what should we do about these Christians? And Pliny said that the more we kill them, the more they increase. So the emperor says, give them a way out. Ask them again and again. And then if they deny, then we're going to kill them. But promise, first use, the carrot and stick. First use the carrot. Promise them something. Promise them wealth and security. Isn't that kind of clever? Then persecute them. But he does say, target the bishops immediately. This idea that if you cut off the head, the body will die. But oddly enough, the opposite happened. And so what you have developed is the cult of martyrs. That martyrdoms led to this development of an early theology. And with very few exceptions, most all the early saints were all martyrs. So, tradition says Peter and Paul were killed in Rome. Peter was supposedly crucified upside down at the Vatican. Paul was beheaded. James was the first murdered. His relics were moved to Spain. So my point being is that, you have these martyrdoms. And so this sounds kind of strange. You had a liturgical cycle of Christ, but then you had a calendar of remembering dates that martyr died. And so the faithful would remember them and celebrate Mass for them, but also keep their relics. So if you look in the Bible, we had the relic of St. Paul's aprons. We had the relics of the apostles. Polycarp would remember their dates and commemorate with a Mass, but also we'd have their relics. Then there's this Diocletian, And Diocletian was administratively a great emperor. But he was called the reincarnation of Nero because of his vicious persecutions. So in this celebration, the letter of Book of Revelation, has the saints under the altar. So Catholics, what's in every altar? Relics. So the catacombs. The catacombs were for burial rites, but altars at this time period started to look like a tomb because you are going to offer your life with Christ. So you have this whole emphasis during the martyrdoms of the theology of martyrdom. It was the ultimate imitation of Christ. But here's the really shocking part. I forgot to bring it, but the martyrs increased the faith. And there's this one document that really just almost like teared me up about this one virgin who gets martyred. And she gets martyred, and the people watching are writing it and said, she inflamed us. She was braver than any soldier. And suddenly this odd thing happens, that the martyrdoms, instead of ruining the church, you would have this admiration of their bravery. And it increased the faith. So there's 10 major persecution. So it's for about the first 300 years. But the odd part is, even with the bloodiest, it increased the church. So that's the odd part. The church, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. That really turned out to be true. This little tiny group of faithful by Christ's eyes overtakes the Roman Empire. But the thing that inflamed people's faith was the bravery of people willing to die for their faith. That actually increased it. And in the theology of martyrdom, this sounds kind of strange, there's a connection between martyrdom and the Eucharist. So, we'll remember the Feast of St. Lawrence. Do you guys know the story of St. Lawrence? Okay, St. Lawrence was a deacon, and he gets captured. And the proconsul says, well, I hear the church has all these treasures. And Lawrence says, well, yes, the church does have all these treasures, but it'll take me 3 days to gather all the treasures. So in 3 days, he comes before and he's collected all the poor and the sick of Rome. Well, he didn't find that funny, so he had Lawrence grilled. So have you ever seen a picture of Lawrence? He's burned to death on a grill. But the funny part is Lawrence, who apparently had a sense of humor, when they're grilling him on one side, he says, I'm done on this side, you can turn me over. It's kind of funny, but here's the point. Before this, he's a deacon, and his bishop gets martyred. And a deacon is connected with a bishop, because remember, a deacon holds up the cup. So think about this. Lawrence would have celebrated Mass with that bishop. And Lawrence said to the bishop when he got martyred, you're going someplace without me? Lawrence, having offered the Mass with the bishop who got martyred, expected to be martyred himself. The point being is that Lawrence's connection of his martyrdom with the Eucharist and care for the poor. So if you read the accounts, the Eucharist is not a martyrdom. Martyrdom is Eucharistic. If you receive the Eucharist, your life is supposed to be poured out. So St. Ignatius, when, remember he gets on this cruelty tour through the Roman Empire, but when he finally dies, it's this beautiful letter where he says, no, let my bones be crushed by grain, like the grain, that his death is this Eucharistic prayer. So martyrdom is Eucharistic. They would have thought that from the very early church. But the odd part, now summing it up, they had all these conversions. Why were there so many massive conversions in the early church? Well, one was because of love. In this one document, this one pagan is writing, and he says, look how they love each other. They take care of the poor. They take care of people outside their own group. So this guy named Stark writes this whole book on it, that in the plagues and sufferings, who took care of the poor? Who took care of the sick? Who, when a plague broke out, most people ran away. Christians ran to the plague and died taking care of others. So it was an example of our love. Or second was injustice. There were no hospitals at the time. And families would keep medicine to themselves. But who started hospitals? Now, technically, the first hospital starts in Sri Lanka, but that was only for the super wealthy. Who started hospitals in the West? It was the Christians. St. Cyprian, once again, said, no, when a plague breaks out, we're going to take care of the very people who persecuted us. That's what our faith does. And so this guy named Gary Furgeon, he's with Johns Hopkins Hospital. He's this expert on the history of hospitals, and even said hospitals are a Christian invention. That Christians were noted for taking care of others, even their worst enemy, and that led to conversions as well. So love, justice, and the major force is the martyrdoms. So, even this is the only, it's not from the Bible, but every time there's a baptism, before you're baptized, your heart is anointed for bravery. Because the early Christians, you were martyred. Now, then in the 4th century, everything changes. And it changes with Constantine. So, this sounds kind of strange. For the first 300 years, all the saints were basically martyrs or apostles. In the 4th century, it's going to change to theologians and administrators. And it changed because of Constantine. Constantine is in York, England. And he does become ruler of the empire after coming down from England, defeating Maxentius in the battle in 312. And he becomes the emperor in the West. Then he'll later battle the emperor in the East and become the sole emperor. But he was a worshiper of Apollo, the sun god. And Constantine, before the battle that he won to become emperor, has this vision. And the sun appears to him and says, under this sign you will conquer. And that's the Chi Rho. So I put it up here. That's a Chi Rho. It's 2 Greek letters. It's a first and second letter of, I want that larger, of the name of Christ. There it is. So he had them paint the Chi Rho on the shields of the soldiers before they went into battle, and of course they won. So with Constantine winning the battle, and under the sign you will conquer, with the name of Christ on the shield, after he becomes emperor, being Christian is the favored status. Now, he stopped the persecutions, kinda. Like there's one more persecution. His nephew becomes emperor after him and starts the persecutions, but that was it. But also, Constantine's mother was Christian, Helena. And she's a saint, but she goes to the Holy Land and preserves all the holy sites in the Holy Land. And it sounds kind of strange. How did they know where the holy sites were in the Holy Land? Like his death and all that? Because the Romans wanted to the Christians built churches over all the important sites of Christ. And Christians in the early church would go to Jerusalem and retrace the steps of Christ. So we have documents about that. But then the Romans came in and wiped Jerusalem off the face of the earth in 70 A.D. And just so that Christians couldn't come back, they put pagan temples over these Christian spots. So it was really easy to know, where the sepulcher was, because the Romans sealed it up and preserved it for us. And St. Helena comes in and restores these sites. Now, I just think this is kind of interesting. In the Church of the Nativity, where she has a church built, she puts this mosaic, and the Magi, you've heard of the Magi in the Nativity story. That's Persian, Magi are Persian priests. Anyhow, centuries later, when the Persians invade and destroy most of the religious sites in the Holy Land, they kept the Church of the Nativity because they saw the mosaic of the Persian Magi. But Constantine wants the empire united. And remember, there's two halves to the empire, the western half and the eastern half. And the majority of the population lived in the Greek side, the eastern half of the empire. So Constantine moves his capital from Rome to Byzantium. Byzantium would have been just a little village, but it's like a perfect defensive structure. It's where east meets west, and he builds Constantinople, builds an entire city. But the problem is that's also the very first crack between the east and the west. And before he departed Rome, he gives palaces to the Catholic Church to worship in. And he sponsored Christian building projects and publications of Bibles and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So not only does he do that, but he had this model: one God, one emperor, one church. So he's going to use the church to unify his empire. And if he's going to have this unified empire, he becomes interested in doctrines and practices of Christians. Now, this sounds kind of strange. He is not a theologian. That's not what I'm saying. But he's a military man, and he wants things clear and organized. So think about this. Go back to the lie. Protestants will say Constantine started the church, that Constantine added pagan practices. Already proved that's not true. Yet in 70 A.D., you have Jerusalem being destroyed. You have the Didache describing how to do masses and baptism in 100. In 96, you have Clement's letter describing the Catholic Church. You have Ignatius' letter describing the Catholic Church. We have documents from the 200 praying to Mary and the martyrs. So the Catholic Church existed before Constantine. So just wanted to make that point. So he didn't create the Catholic Church, but he does want it organized. And so what was happening is this thing called a synod. So local churches would have synods. So this local church, if there's a problem, you guys would meet, the bishops and church would meet about some problem, and you guys would. But there wasn't like one where all of them met together in a council. There was in the early church. The first council was Jerusalem. But Constantine does want things organized. So he calls together 300 bishops from around the empire. And on the anniversary of him being named emperor, he gathers them all together in his summer palace in Nicaea. And he paid for the whole thing, but he wants to get his money's worth for the cost. So anyhow, kind of interesting. As all are processing in, Constantine the Emperor had this bishop early bishops who were persecuted come in last, and he knelt before them. Now, unfortunately, I have a lot more to say, but we've got an hour. But I'll just finish up this. With this, the controversy at this time was called Arianism. And Arianism was this idea that, well, Jesus was super holy, but it was like a mini-God. So there's God and Christ, who's a mini-God. Now, I hate to say this. A lot of Christians, the way they speak of Christ, they speak of Christ as a mini-God. Does that make sense? No, he's fully God. So the emperor wanted this all marked out. So we have Eusebius, a historian who wrote about the whole thing. So with Eusebius, we know, I still feel I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to keep talking. But just to explain, bishops, how are bishops elected? Well, in the early church, what would happen is that the whole church would gather together, pray for 3 days, and then we're electing you bishop. So it was a whole church that elected a bishop. So Eusebius, we know, and then later that became too complicated. So local churches would choose a priest, and a bishop would ordain him, and then the priests would gather together and choose the bishop. That is officially how the Catholic Church is supposed to work, even today, but that's not how it really works. But even like if you go to bishop's ordination or priest's ordination, the same way Eusebius describes the ordination still happens exactly the same way. But there's one point, if you've ever seen a bishop's or a priest's ordination, they'll say, do you elect this person as your bishop? And everybody applauds. That was election. Now, so the ballot's kind of stuffed because you only have one choice. But still, without an election, it invalidates it. But anyhow, so Constantine, he's not a theologian, but he is a gifted organizer. So he forces these bishops to come together and argue out and get the church organized. So he didn't create the Catholic Church, but he does add order to it. And these councils were incredibly influential. Remember, the most powerful thing in the Catholic Church is not the Pope, it's a council. The great majority of Christians today, Catholic, Orthodox, accept these teachings. So it shows not just the power of the council, but how the early church becomes more and more organized. And then you have the Donatist controversy. We met about that. And then at Nicaea, they expand the Apostles' Creed. So you had a creed that you would celebrate, you would say at Mass. Where did we get that from? Judaism. Judaism has a creed. Except we just replaced the Jewish creed with Apostles' Creed that the apostles gave us. So yeah, even in the Bible, you have creeds. Like St. Paul, when he says one God, one baptism, one Lord, that's a creed. Or that part in Paul's letter where he writes, though Christ was in the form of God, he did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at. That was a creed. Those are Paul's words. That's a creed that you would recite at baptism. And so the Christian church always had creeds. We get it from Judaism, and in Jewish worship, after the Torah is read, you would recite a creed. Well, because of these arguments, they expanded the Apostles' Creed into the Nicene Creed. Now, Protestants will say, well, our creed is the Bible, but that very statement is a creed. And creeds don't replace the Bible, they clarify it, is my point. So what Constantine does is organize the Catholic Church. Does that make sense? It was already had a structure, but he wants things unified. One God, one emperor, one church. So, now, we've gone an hour. I'm still going to next week talk about the Romification of the Catholic Church, what influence Rome had. But does this make sense? Okay. Questions, objections? Catherine? I'm a little bit off.
I have a Jewish friend, and she said that we do not believe in heaven or hell or purgatory. When they die, we just go to dust.
No, that's not quite true. She has a Jewish friend who says they don't believe in heaven or purgatory or hell. That's not quite true. That's what she believes. Actually, Jews at the time believed you wouldn't go to heaven. You'd go to Sheol. So you know in the creed where you say Christ descended into hell? That's actually not what it says. That's what it says in English. Christ descended into Sheol. When the Christ comes, he would bring about the resurrection. So what about all those people, Abraham, Adam, Eve, who died before Christ? The Jews had this concept that they're in this waiting place called Sheol, and when Christ brings a resurrection, he would resurrect them as well. So she doesn't. But yeah, the Jews don't, they believe in Sheol until the Christ comes. But she doesn't believe in heaven. They believe Christ will come. Mm-hmm. Okay, other questions? Objections? Yeah. Yeah, most Protestants say the church started in the 300s, but there's no evidence of that. There's tons of... Oh, Lutherans believe that too. Yeah. Pretty much Luther did. I'll get that when I get to Lutheranism, but yeah, he does. It's a great apostasy, yeah. Everybody got it wrong but Luther. That's basically what he says. All right, God bless. We'll meet next week. Oh, I have one more slide if you want to see it. So, if you're... Oh, that didn't look up. That's didn't show up well, but our new St. Pius, it's his play. It's P in the letter 10, but it's a chi-rho, if that makes sense. All right. Thank you.